Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into the mathematical deep end today, but trust us, the view from down here is pretty spectacular.
It really is.
Imagine every time you authorize, say, a decentralized transaction, or your smart meter reports back to the power company, or even when you send a truly private message, you're actually performing this complex, virtually uncrackable mathematical ceremony. It's happening all the time, unseen.
That's exactly right. We're talking about the unseen mathematical architecture of digital identity and trust online. You shared some fascinating sources with us.
Yeah, covering some pretty advanced stuff.
Definitely. Advanced elliptic curve cryptography, the architectural vulnerabilities of critical infrastructure, thinking smart grid here, and also the latest hardware attacks targeting the very silicon chips that hold our secrets.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really pull out the core knowledge from all that material. We need to get a handle on precisely how elliptic curve cryptography, ECC, and related asymmetric systems secure our digital identity.
And across very different areas, too.
Right. We'll look at decentralized platforms like blockchain, where these ECC keys are fundamentally your identity, your wallet address.
Yeah, that's a massive real-world application right there.
And then we'll pivot to these high-risk, low-power environments. Thinking of the Internet of Things, IoT, especially the devices underpinning critical infrastructure. Huge challenges there.
Absolutely. So we've broken this down into 4 key segments for you. First, we'll lay the foundation, the role of public and private key systems in creating identity. And there's some interesting, almost partisan history there and how this math got adopted.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Then second, we'll see ECC really in action. We'll look at some complex protocols that use these curves to set up fresh, secure communication secrets between parties.
Got it.
Third, we tackle that huge challenge, miniaturizing this high-level security for those tiny, power-sipping IoT devices, especially in the smart grid context. The tension between security and, well, battery life.
That sounds critical. And finally,
we confront the ultimate vulnerability. How do we protect the physical private key credential itself? Because it turns out it's not always about breaking the math. Sometimes it's about attacking the hardware, maybe manipulating its power supply.
wow. Okay, from pure math to, physical sabotage. It's quite a journey.
It is indeed. Ready to start. Let's begin with the fundamental mathematics that actually creates a provable digital identity.
Perfect.
Okay.
Let's unpack the core mechanisms, the nuts and bolts, that make digital identity even possible today.
All right, so the moment we start talking about digital identity or ownership or non-repudiation, that ability to prove a transaction came from you and only you, we're inevitably talking about asymmetric cryptography, the public key system.
That's the bedrock. Modern digital trust really rests on this. It's all based on that pair of keys. The public key, which you can share far and wide, no problem there.
Right.
And the private key. That's the one that must be kept absolutely fundamentally secret. And it seems so obvious now, doesn't it? But your point about the history, our sources highlighted that adopting this wasn't exactly smooth sailing. There was resistance.
Oh, definitely. It wasn't just a neat technical integration. When these public key algorithms were first being proposed, discussed openly in the research community, it was happening at the same time as a major, quite heated debate over the U.S. government's symmetric standard, DES, the data encryption standard.
DES. Right. And that's where the historical drama kicks in.
Pretty much. You had prominent cryptographers like Marty Hellman, as mentioned, who were highly critical of the DES proposal. Their main argument, the key length was just too small.
Even back then, they saw it coming. Moore's law and all that.
Exactly. It was clear even then that computing power was on an upward trajectory. A shorter key would eventually become vulnerable to just brute force guessing over time.
So how did the establishment react to this new asymmetric idea, the two-key system?
Well, what's fascinating and kind of surprising is the almost adversarial response it got. The sources use the phrase partisan politics in the cryptographic community.
Wow. Partisan politics over math.
Seems strange, right?
It
But the existing cryptographic establishment, particularly government agencies, they apparently viewed this discovery of two-key crypto more as though it were a competing product than a recent research discovery.
A competing product.
Yeah.
It's quite a framing. And wasn't there a claim from the NSA around that time?
That's the famous story, yeah. The NSA reportedly claimed they had actually discovered the concepts behind public key cryptography maybe a decade earlier.
But they couldn't prove it.
Crucially, no. They offered no public proof, citing classification. So you had this really extraordinary situation. Here's this foundational technology for the entire digital world. I mean, a way to establish identity without ever sharing a secret beforehand. And it was initially met with skepticism, maybe even resistance, from the very institutions supposed to be securing communications.
It's a powerful lesson, isn't it? How institutional inertia or bias can really slow down even purely mathematical or technological progress.
Definitely.
Okay, so we have this pair of keys establishing an identity. But the system's no good unless we have a practical way to use that identity to, say, approve something, a message, a blockchain transaction, whatever.
Yeah.
That brings us to digital signatures, right? And hashing.
Exactly. Digital signatures are that unforgeable proof of approval. If your private key signs a message, then anyone, absolutely anyone, can use your public key to verify that signature. It's a mathematical proof that you, the unique owner of that private key, authorized it.
But signing huge things sounds slow. How does hashing make it work?
That's the key to making it practical, the efficiency gain. Think about the computational load. If you had to perform those complex math operations, especially something like an ECC operation we'll get into on a massive document, maybe a gigabyte video file.
Forget it. It would take forever.
Hours, maybe days. Huge amounts of power. Hashing solves this beautifully. It takes that massive input, whatever it is, and crunches it down into a tiny fixed-length digest, a fingerprint, essentially. The sources mentioned examples like a 160-bit hash.
Much smaller.
Way smaller. And you sign that tiny hash instead of the whole document.
Okay, so that dramatically cuts the computation, makes signatures basically instantaneous.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the security model relies on the hash being one way. What does that mean, and why is it so critical?
That's the absolute linchpin. One way means it's computationally infeasible to reverse the process. You can't go from that 160-bit output back to the original gigabyte file.
Okay, makes sense.
But even more important is collision resistance. This means it should be practically impossible to find two different inputs, say, two different documents that produce the exact same hash output.
Ah, okay. And if it wasn't collision resistant, if you could find collisions easily?
That would be catastrophic. The sources paint a vivid picture. Imagine an attacker crafting two documents. One is the legitimate contract you think you're signing, maybe for a small payment. The other is something nefarious, maybe transferring ownership of your house.
Okay.
If the attacker could engineer both documents so they produce the exact same 160-bit hash value.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The moment you digitally sign the hash for the small payment, you've unknowingly also signed the hash for the house transfer document. You'd be, as the source puts it, duped into signing a multitude of documents.
That's terrifying. The entire security of your identity, your approval, rests on the mathematical difficulty of finding those hash collisions.
Precisely. It's why cryptographically secure hash functions are so fundamental.
And once we trust that hash function, the implications, especially for things like digital assets on a blockchain, are huge, particularly around privacy.
Absolutely enormous. Because the signature is tied to the hash, not the document itself, you can keep the signature separate from the content. This is foundational for proving ownership of digital assets.
Like the copyright example.
Exactly. The sources mentioned Alice could copyright a document. She hashes it, maybe posts that hash publicly on a blockchain timestamped ledger, but she keeps the actual document completely secret.
Until she needs to prove it.
Right. Only if someone challenges her copyright does she need to reveal the document and show that, yes, this specific document produces the hash that was publicly registered way back when. That separation of proof from the content itself is a cornerstone of privacy in modern digital ownership.
So the math is powerful, incredibly powerful, but it's also complex, involving things like exponentiation, modular arithmetic, especially for older systems like RSA. Speaking of RSA, it's foundational, right? And breaking it, getting the private key, is basically as hard as factoring the big number n, which is p times q. Yeah, how do computers even do these huge calculations fast enough to be useful?
Yeah, that's where computational ingenuity really meets the cryptography. The pure math wouldn't be practical without some clever optimizations. Specifically, implementations rely heavily on algorithms for fast exponentiation.
Like the fastx snippet mentioned.
Exactly. That type of algorithm drastically reduces the number of operations needed. If you just naively calculated a to the power of b modulo n, you'd need to do b minus 1 multiplications.
And b, the exponent, can be a massive number in crypto keys, thousands of bits long. So that's just impossible.
Completely infeasible. But these fast exponentiation algorithms, often using the binary representation of the exponent, cut that down dramatically. The number of operations becomes proportional to the length of the exponent in bits, not its actual value.
Ah, it's a big difference.
Huge difference. It drops the average number of operations to something like 1.5 times the number of bits in the exponent. That's the difference between a calculation taking potentially the age of the universe and taking, a millisecond on a standard computer today.
So that efficiency is really the unseen engine making public key identity practical for, well, pretty much every secure transaction we do online.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's
Yeah.
absolutely fundamental.
Okay, now let's drill down specifically into elliptic curve cryptography, ECC. This seems to be the method of choice for, well, almost all modern high-speed decentralized identity systems, including, as we mentioned, the public-private key pairs that function as wallet addresses across major blockchains. Why ECC? Why did it largely supersede older algorithms like RSA in these newer applications?
That's a really key question. The fundamental answer lies in the underlying mathematical problem ECC is based on. RSA, as we just discussed, relies on the difficulty of factoring large composite integers, integer factorization.
Right.
ECC, on the other hand, relies on the difficulty of solving something called the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem, or ECDLP. Now, the crucial difference is that for the same level of security, meaning the same estimated difficulty for an attacker to break at the ECDLP appears to be significantly harder.
Exponentially harder, I think the sources said.
That's the term used, yes. Exponentially harder to solve than integer factorization for comparable key sizes.
And what does that translate to practically for a digital identity or a transaction?
It means we achieve the same level of cryptographic strength, but with significantly shorter keys. Much shorter. For instance, a 256-bit ECC key offers roughly the same security as a 3072-bit RSA key.
Wow, that's a huge difference in size.
It really is, and think about the context. A decentralized network with lots of transactions flying around, or a tiny, low-power IoT device. Shorter keys mean faster calculations, less data to transmit over the network, and a much smaller memory footprint needed to store and process the key.
So that efficiency and portability, that's really why ECC became the bedrock for millions, maybe billions, of blockchain identities and other modern systems.
Exactly. It just fits the constraints of modern applications much better.
And when we look under the hood at how the math actually works, it's quite different from basic integer arithmetic, isn't it? The sources mention ECDSA, the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, and some specific functions.
Yeah, the operations are definitely more complex because they're not just manipulating numbers, they're manipulating points on a specific mathematical curve. The verification process for an ECDSA signature, for example, involves operations like elliptic mul, that's elliptic curve point multiplication, and elliptic sum, which is adding 2 points on the curve.
Not your high school algebra, then.
Not quite. Point multiplication is especially core to the security. That's where you take a known base point, let's call it hey down the curve, and you multiply it by your secret private key, which is just a large integer, let's say dollars. The result, pay k equals d times pay, is another point on the curve, and that becomes your public key.
Okay.
Now, because of the mathematical properties of these elliptic curves, it's relatively easy to compute t-tellers if you know the dollars and dollars, but it's computationally infeasible, given only p-teller dollars, to work backwards and figure out the secret multiplier dollars. That's the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem we mentioned. That asymmetry is the heart of ECC security.
Got it. So these ECC keys serve as our durable, sort of permanent digital identity credential. But often, for actual secure communication, like sending encrypted messages, we don't want to use that long-term key directly. We need a fresh secret for each conversation, right? That leads to these advanced protocols like X3DH.
Precisely. X3DH, the extended triple Diffie-Hellman protocol, is a really elegant example of modern key establishment. It's particularly vital for asynchronous messaging, think Signal or WhatsApp, where the two people talking, let's call them Alice and Bob, might not be online at the exact same time.
And it provides forward secrecy. What's that again?
Forward secrecy means that even if an attacker eventually compromises your long-term identity keys, your main ECC private keys, they still can't decrypt your past conversations. That's because the keys used to encrypt those past messages were temporary ephemeral session keys that were generated for that specific conversation and then discarded. X3DH is designed to generate these secure ephemeral session keys.
Okay, so how does X3DH use those durable identity keys to bootstrap these fresh session keys, especially if Alice and Bob aren't online together?
It's quite clever. It uses multiple ECC key pairs and relies on a server to store some public key material. Each user, Alice and Bob, publishes a long-term identity key, IK1, that's their main ECC key pair. They also generate and publish a signed pre-key. This lies as another ECC key pair, but its public part is signed by the IK to prove it genuinely belongs to that identity.
Okay, so the server holds Bob's public IK dollars and his signed public IK doll. Alice wants to start talking to Bob. What does she do?
Alice downloads Bob's public IKs from the server. Then Alice generates her own temporary ECC key pair just for this session, called an ephemeral key.
So now we got several keys in play. Alice's long-term IKer, her temporary IK, and Bob's long-term IKLers, and his signed pre-key Geber.
Exactly. Now, the core of X3DH is performing Diffie-Hellman DH key exchanges. DH is a standard way for two parties to securely establish a shared secret over an insecure channel using their public-private key pairs. X3DH performs DH calculations in, as the source material puts it, all the feasible ways involving Alice's keys and Bob's keys from the server.
All feasible ways, like what specifically?
Specifically, it calculates 3 shared secrets. 1 DH between Alice's identity key and Bob's signed pre-key, IBIS pre-key. 3 DH between Alice's ephemeral key and Bob's identity key. 3 DH between Alice's ephemeral key and Bob's signed pre-key, SPKTP. There might be a fourth one involving Bob's one-time pre-keys, but these 3 are the core.
That sounds complex. Why so many different combinations? Is it redundancy?
It's not really redundancy. It's about achieving both authentication and forward secrecy robustly. For example, the first calculation, DH, aka SPKB would, authenticates Alice using her long-term key against Bob's signed key. The combinations involving Alice's ephemeral key ensure forward secrecy. Even if Alice's long-term IK is later compromised, the session key depends on IKB, which is temporary.
Okay, so you get these 3 or 4 intermediate shared secrets from the DH calculations. Then what?
All those resulting secret values are then concatenated together, just strung together into one long sequence and fed into a key derivation function, or KDF. This is typically based on a secure hash function.
And the output of that KDF, that final hash that's the fresh key for the session.
That's the one. Only Alice, possessing her private keys, IKPix, and Bob, possessing his IKPAP4, could perform those specific ECC Diffie-Hellman calculations and combine them in the right way to arrive at that exact shared secret
So that key is then used for what?
That fresh key, KEB, is used as the symmetric encryption key, like AES, to encrypt the actual conversation between Alice and Bob. And crucially, once the session is over and Alice's ephemeral key, AEKA, are discarded.
Got it. So X3DH is a beautiful example of how those durable ECC digital identities are used to bootstrap secure communication channels with constantly renewed ephemeral secrets. A compromise of one session doesn't compromise others, and even compromising the long-term identity key doesn't compromise past sessions.
Exactly. It provides very strong security guarantees essential for modern private messaging.
That's a deep dive on using keys for signing and establishing secrets. But our sources also touched on something else. Identification protocols that don't use signatures or encryption. They use asymmetric techniques based on zero-knowledge proofs. How does that fit into proving identity?
Zero-knowledge proofs, or ZKPs. They represent a fundamentally different way to think about authentication. The standard model, like we've been discussing, usually involves proving who you are by either revealing a secret, like a password, or performing an action only you can do with your secret, like creating a digital signature with your private key.
Right. Show the secret or use the secret.
ZKPs flip that. They allow you, the prover, to convince a verifier that you possess knowledge of a certain secret without revealing the secret itself or any information about it, other than the fact that you know it.
Wait, so I don't show you my password, I don't sign anything, but I prove to you that I do know the password. How does that even work?
It's based on interactive proof systems. Think of it as a carefully structured challenge and response game between the prover, who knows the secret, and the verifier. The verifier asks the prover a question, the challenge, that is easy to answer if you know the secret, but practically impossible to answer correctly otherwise. The challenge is usually randomized. The prover uses their secret knowledge to compute the correct response and sends it back. Now, a single correct response might not be convincing. Maybe they got lucky.
Right. Our sources mentioned something about revealing only one bit about the prover's knowledge. That sounds tiny.
It is tiny for a single round,
Yeah.
but the magic is in iteration and the randomization. The verifier doesn't just ask one question. They repeat this challenge response cycle many times, maybe 80 or 100 times, using fresh random challenges each time.
So the odds stack up.
Precisely. If the prover answers correctly every single time across, say, 80 independent random challenges, the probability that they were just guessing or cheating becomes astronomically small, like 280 times, which is effectively zero in cryptographic terms.
So you get strong identity verification through probability without ever transmitting the actual secret credential.
Exactly. It offers incredibly strong authentication while preserving privacy because the underlying secret is never exposed. This makes ZKPs potentially very valuable for future identity systems where minimizing data exposure is paramount.
Okay, we've really established how this sophisticated ECC math provides strong digital identity, especially in areas like decentralized finance, where the key is the identity. Now let's pivot, quite sharply actually, to the physical world, specifically critical infrastructure, and this immense security challenge posed by potentially billions of tiny, low-power Internet of Things devices, the ones forming the backbone of systems like the smart grid.
Yeah, this is a completely different beast, a fundamentally different security landscape. The smart grid itself is vast, covering energy generation, high voltage transmission, local distribution, right down to the smart meters in our homes.
And historically, how are these industrial control systems secured?
Traditionally, they relied heavily on physical isolation, the so-called air gap, keeping them separate from the internet, or maybe just security through obscurity, assuming nobody knew how the protocols worked or could get access.
And our sources were pretty blunt about this. That old paradigm, it's completely dead now, isn't it?
It is absolutely gone. The modern grid and many industrial systems are increasingly interconnected. They have to be, for efficiency, for monitoring, for control. But that means an attack can potentially originate from almost anywhere, maybe an edge device out in the field, and propagate deep into the core control systems.
You mentioned relying on billions of 3-cent chips to protect trillion-dollar infrastructure. That paints quite a picture.
It highlights the scale of the problem, the sheer number of devices, and their often minimal cost and consequently minimal built-in security.
Can you walk us through that propagation risk? Where does an attack typically start in this kind of IoT environment?
The major concern is often described as the field-to-SCADA threat model. SCADA stands for supervisory control and data acquisition. These are the main computer systems monitoring and controlling the industrial processes, like the power grid. Attacks often originate out in the field on those remote devices like sensors, smart meters, remote terminal units, RTUs, actuators, and things that are physically distributed, sometimes easily accessible, and almost always severely resource constrained in terms of power and computing capability.
Did the sources give any concrete examples of how this could happen?
Yeah, one specific scenario mentioned was injecting malicious code into a smart meter. Maybe not through the network initially, but through a local physical port, like an infrared interface technicians use for maintenance.
Okay, so a compromised meter, then what?
Once that meter is compromised, it's connected to the network, often something called the Advanced Metering Infrastructure, or AMI. From there, the malware could potentially spread laterally to other meters on the same network, or it could try to move vertically upwards towards the distribution management systems or the main SCADA servers that collect the meter data.
And there was a real-world case mentioned, too.
Yes, there was an example cited where malware actually originated on a device within a plant's control network and managed to propagate through the internal industrial networks all the way up into the company's corporate business systems. The lines are blurring between the operational technology, OT network, and the traditional IT network. That cheap device out in the field can become a gateway.
This brings us right back to ECC and digital identity. If these tiny edge devices, the RTUs, the smart meters, relays in substations, sensors on turbines, if they are the primary attack surface, they desperately need strong identity authentication. They need to prove they are legitimate and are sending valid data.
Absolutely critical.
But they run on minimal power, minimal memory. That's the core tension, isn't it? The need for high security versus the extreme resource constraints.
It's a massive tension. You need robust cryptography, arguably ECC-level security, because the consequences of a successful attack are potentially catastrophic. You could disrupt power delivery, cause physical damage, destabilize the grid.
But you have to implement it on these specialized devices, as the sources called them, running on maybe milliwatts of power with just kilobytes of RAM, often no cooling fans, sitting out in harsh environmental conditions.
Exactly. So you can't just install a big, standard security software suite like you would on a server or a laptop.
The countermeasures themselves have to be tiny.
They have to be minimized and miniaturized, as the sources put it. Lightweight enough, efficient enough, to be embedded everywhere throughout the grid infrastructure. This requires a different design focus, moving away from general-purpose operating systems towards real-time operating systems, RTOSs, that are built for predictability and efficiency. It means inspecting network traffic in real time using algorithms that are incredibly lean.
ECC helps here, though, right, with the smaller key sizes?
It helps immensely. That smaller key size compared to RSA for the same security level is a huge advantage in these constrained environments. But even implementing ECC efficiently on a tiny microcontroller requires very careful engineering and optimization.
And this whole situation, the risk from the field devices, it forces a fundamental shift in how you design the network security itself.
It absolutely mandates it. It reinforces what should be a basic security premise, especially in industrial networks. Denying by default all communications, you have to start from a position of zero trust. Assume any device trying to connect, especially from the field, is potentially hostile until proven otherwise.
So only allow very specific, known, authenticated communication paths and protocols that are absolutely necessary for operation. Everything else is blocked.
That's the principle. It's much harder to implement in practice across millions of devices, but that zero trust, deny by default posture is now considered essential for critical infrastructure security.
Given how critical these systems are, but also how vulnerable these edge devices might be, designers must have a plan for what happens when security does fail, or when something goes wrong. This connects to that idea of an explicit trade-off between reliability and security.
Yes, every critical system designer needs to think through and define a clear degradation strategy. It's often a difficult, philosophical decision you have to make upfront before deployment. When things go wrong, which is worse? Prioritizing keeping the service operational at all costs, reliability even if security is weakened, or prioritizing maintaining security, even if it means shutting down the service.
Can you give that bank example again? That made it very clear.
Sure. The source used the example of a bank whose two-factor authentication to a case system goes offline. What do?
Option 1. Prioritize reliability.
Right. Keep the service running. Maybe they decide to temporarily allow users to log in with just their password, bypassing the unavailable 2FA. The service stays up, but the security posture is significantly weakened during that outage.
Option 2. Prioritize security.
In this case, the bank might decide the risk of unauthorized account access without 2FA is simply too high. So they make the explicit trade-off. They choose to disable all logins entirely until the 2FA system is back online. This guarantees security integrity, but results in a complete service outage for users.
Reliability takes a hit to maintain security.
Exactly. And in the smart grid context, this could be even more stark. It might mean choosing to automatically disconnect a section of the grid or shut down a generator if the control signals coming from its remote monitoring unit suddenly fail cryptographic authentication checks.
Yeah.
You sacrifice the power flow reliability to prevent the possibility of a malicious actor sending dangerous commands, security. Making that choice consciously, that intentional sacrifice of uptime for integrity, is a sign of mature security thinking in critical systems.
Okay, we've built this picture. From a multi-billion-dollar crypto wallet down to a tiny sensor and a power grid relay, the whole security structure fundamentally rests on possessing one specific thing, that secret private key, often an ECC key.
It all comes down to that key.
But the moment the key stops being just abstract math and gets physically stored or processed on a piece of silicon, it suddenly becomes vulnerable to attacks that aren't purely mathematical, right? Physical attacks.
This is really the ultimate weak point, isn't it? We've spent all this time talking about the computational hardness of breaking ECC or RSA math, the strength of the algorithms. But at the end of the day, those algorithms run on physical hardware, and that hardware can be manipulated.
We're talking about side channel attacks and fault injection attacks.
Exactly. These attacks don't try to guess the key through brute force or find a flaw in the algorithm itself. Instead, they try to trick or coerce the physical hardware while it's processing the key into leaking information about it.
Okay, let's break down the examples from the sources. First one was CLK Screw. Sounds like something out of a spy movie. What was that about?
CLK Screw is a perfect example of a timing-based side channel attack. It involved physically manipulating the clock speed of the processor, specifically overclocking an ARM processor on a Google Nexus 6 phone.
Overclocking, making it run faster than intended. Why would an attacker do that for security?
Because critical security components, like the ARM Trust Zone, which is a hardware feature designed to create a secure, isolated environment for cryptographic operations and key storage, rely on precise timing and correct execution flow. By aggressively overclocking the chip, pushing it way beyond its specified limits, the attackers could induce timing errors or race conditions within the trust zone environment.
And those errors allowed them to bypass the security.
Effectively, yes. The instability caused by the extreme clock speed allowed them to defeat the isolation guarantees of trust zone and ultimately extract the cryptographic keys that were supposed to be protected inside it.
Wow, so simply making the chip run too fast breaks the hardware security designed to protect the very key material.
Yep.
Okay, what about the second example? Plundervolt, that targeted voltage, right?
Yeah.
Even more direct manipulation.
Plunderbolt is particularly chilling, I think, because it targeted a core feature of modern processors, specifically Intel Core processors. These CPUs have sophisticated power management features, including dynamic voltage scaling, where the chip adjusts its operating voltage based on the current workload to save power.
Right, laptops do that all the time to save battery.
Exactly. But the researchers behind Plundervolt discovered they could exploit an undocumented aspect of this voltage scaling interface. They found a way to intentionally trigger brief, precisely timed undervoltage events while the processor was performing sensitive operations.
Undervolting. So starving the chip of power momentarily, what happens then?
When you undervolt a complex chip while it's performing an intricate calculation, it's likely to make errors. It doesn't have enough stable power to compute correctly. If you can time this undervoltage glitch perfectly, say, right when the CPU is in the middle of a critical multiplication step inside an RSA signature calculation or during an AES encryption round using the specialized AES-NI hardware instructions,
A calculation goes wrong.
the chip produces a faulty result. Instead of the correct output of the multiplication or the encryption step, it returns a slightly incorrect value. Now, one faulty result doesn't give you the key, but by inducing many of these faults, targeting specific operations, and carefully analyzing the patterns in the incorrect outputs...
They can work backwards.
Yes. Using techniques from differential fault analysis, the attackers could systematically deduce the bits of the secret RSA or AES keys being used inside the processor.
That's incredible. The implication is just massive, isn't it? We need to worry just as much about the stability of the power supply and the physical shielding of the processor as we do about the strength of the ECC curve itself.
Absolutely. Your digital identity, your cryptocurrency, your secure communications, they are all fundamentally tied to the quality and integrity of the electricity feeding the silicon chip that holds your private key.
It really underscores the need for robust hardware-based key storage solutions, doesn't it? Things like trusted platform modules, TPMs, or dedicated hardware security modules, HSMs.
Exactly right. These are specialized, tamper-resistant hardware components designed specifically to protect cryptographic keys from these kinds of physical and electrical attacks. They create a much more secure boundary around the key material, making side-channel and fault injection attacks significantly harder, if not impossible. Moving sensitive key operations into a dedicated HSM or TPM is becoming best practice, especially for high-value keys.
So shifting gears slightly to the broader cybersecurity picture. Once we accept that even the hardware isn't foolproof, that breaches can happen despite our best efforts with crypto and hardware, the focus has to shift, doesn't it? From pure prevention to something else.
It does. It shifts towards detection, forensics, and resilience. Modern threat assessment is sophisticated, but it operates under the assumption that determined attackers, maybe nation-states or organized crime, might use zero-day vulnerabilities or advanced persistent threats, APTs. These are attacked using methods that are unknown or undiscovered until after they've been successfully used.
So you might not even know you're vulnerable until it's too late.
Precisely. And the attacker's goal might vary. It could be intelligence gathering, stealing financial assets, disrupting services, or maybe just demonstrating a capability to undermine trust. Many risks simply aren't fully understood until after an incident occurs.
So if perfect prevention is impossible, what becomes the ultimate defense goal then?
The focus shifts heavily towards detection and resilience. Designing systems with multiple layers of defense, robust monitoring, and anomaly detection capabilities so you can spot an attack or a compromise as early as possible. And then, crucially, having the ability to respond quickly, contain the damage, and repair the system swiftly.
So good forensics become key.
Absolutely. A comprehensive forensic capability to understand how the breach happened, what was compromised, and how to patch the vulnerability is essential. It's less about building an impenetrable fortress and more about building a system that can withstand attacks, detect them quickly, and recover gracefully.
Okay, let's bring this all home, tying it back to the bigger picture of digital identity and data ownership. This is a concept that these decentralized identity systems, often built on ECC keys, promise to really change.
Yeah, this is where the cryptography meets the legal and philosophical questions about who controls our data. The current situation, particularly noted in the U.S. context in our sources, is that personal information is often treated legally as an asset owned by the collector, the company that gathers your data, rather than the individual it pertains to.
Which is quite different from the approach in Europe, for example, with GDPR giving individuals more rights.
Exactly. That collector-centric model in the U.S. fuels the massive data aggregation industry we see today. Now, the promise of decentralized identity, sometimes called self-sovereign identity, SSI, built upon your own private ECC key that you control.
It flips the power dynamic.
Yeah, that's the idea. It aims to flip that dynamic entirely. When your core digital identity credential is mathematically tied to a private key that only you possess, ideally stored securely, like in an HSM or TPM on your device, it gives the individual radical control. You decide when and to whom you reveal aspects of your identity. You can prove specific things, I am over 18, without revealing everything. Here is my exact date of birth and address. You don't necessarily need a central company acting as an intermediary for every interaction.
Sounds revolutionary.
Yeah.
But it still all hinges on protecting that one private key, doesn't it? Which we just spent 10 minutes discussing can be attacked physically through voltage glitches or overclocking.
And that's the critical caveat. Decentralized identity offers immense potential for individual empowerment and privacy, but the ultimate failure point still remains the security of that private key credential. If you lose control of that key, whether through a sophisticated hardware exploit like Plundervold, or simply through malware stealing the key file, or even basic social engineering tricking you into revealing it, then you lose the mathematical proof of your digital self within that system.
So the future challenge is really twofold.
I think so. It's about marrying the powerful mathematics, the robust ECC curves, maybe future quantum-resistant algorithms, the privacy-preserving potential of zero-knowledge proofs, with equally robust, truly unhackable physical protection for the keys themselves. Achieving that combination is how we might finally deliver on the full promise of individual data sovereignty and secure digital identity.
That feels like a perfect distillation of the journey we've taken. We started with that surprising political drama around the very discovery of public key cryptography.
Yeah, being treated like a competing product.
Right. Then we saw how advanced ECC functions as the absolute core identity mechanism in massive systems like blockchain. We explored that incredibly difficult challenge of securing tiny, low-power sensors in critical industrial systems.
The miniaturization problem.
And we ended up face-to-face with the physical reality that the strongest math is only as secure as the physical container holding that all-important private key.
It really brings the whole stack into focus, from abstract theory down to the silicon and the power lines. And it echoes that initial discovery of public key crypto back in the 70s, seen by the establishment, more as though it were a competing product than a recent research discovery. Yet it completely transformed digital security.
Which leads us perfectly to the final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. Consider this. How might the next revolutionary approach to digital identity, maybe something based on quantum-safe curves that resist quantum computer attacks, or perhaps advanced zero-knowledge methods that somehow eliminate the need to even store a persistent secret key? How might that new approach be similarly underestimated, or maybe initially resisted by the current establishment, even as the security risks we've discussed today with ECC and hardware continue to grow? What part will you play in understanding, advocating for, or perhaps even implementing that next generation of secure digital identity?